had military objectives. And then, of course, the ultimate goal of civilians and creating a civilian population for the Spanish crown. And so the site that I'm focused on tonight is the Mission and Presidio of San Carlos de Monterey, which was initially founded as a joint settlement. These sites did eventually separate, and so I will be talking about the Presidio, kind of jumping a little bit between the Presidio and the mission itself, but generally I kind of still think of them as sites that are together, even though they physically separated. Okay, so fun fact, I don't know if everyone knows this, but this is just something that popped up as I was going through, was that even though Monterey, the San Carlos Presidio and mission was founded in 1770, Monterey was actually proposed to be settled in 1606. And this was ordered by King Philip III, and they had money set aside. But what is the Spanish stereotype? What will distract a Spaniard? What was it? The other thing, the sparkly one. Gold, gold, silver, gold, yes. So basically they were all ready to settle Monterey, 1606, and then apparently some islands of gold and silver came out and they're just like, forget that, and they moved on. So this settlement of Monterey got put on hold. And it wasn't until what is known as the Sacred Expedition that Monterey as a settlement became seriously an objective. You know, the threat of the Russians coming in, got to beat them. And so essentially Presidio and Mission of Monterey become settled some 150 years plus later, which brings us to the Mission of Presidio of Monterey, founded in 1770. Just a little map to kind of situate where we're at. You can see in this map, we have the separation of the Presidio and the mission for, like I said, I'll be kind of going back and forth between both sites, but I think I made it clear in the slides, like which is which, but sort of collectively referring to both. Just another perspective. I believe these are Jose Guadero's illustrations done in 1790-ish. At the top in blue, you have the Mission San Carlos, and at the bottom in red, you have the Presidio. Okay, so, well, what is the focus of this talk? Right, just a little backdrop, make sure we're on the same page of Spanish colonialism. But I'm here to focus on, maybe I should touch this, I don't know, I guess. Make it go away, so it's not distracting everyone. But here to talk about drought. And I know that since we're mostly Californians, right, we're probably all familiar with these issues of drought and how we experience it in the present. And so, as I mentioned before, in 2018, there kind of became this discussion of like, how did, you know, different people respond to different climatic events like drought, especially in California. So just to make sure we're working with the same understanding, drought is when we're looking at any type of imbalance in water for any type of period of time, whether it's short or long term, and usually tied to some type of deficit of precipitation. What I learned as I kind of looked into this kind of climate study, which again is not my main area, I learned there's different types of drought, which was news to me. Maybe it shouldn't have been, but I was like, oh, tell me more. And basically you have your kind of traditional drought, right, where it's naturally occurring, but there's more, right? There's always more. You have agricultural and then hydrological drought. And so agricultural drought is tied to the soil, essentially, and hydrological is tied to basically the availability of a given water resource. And once you put humans into the situation, right, that's going to impact one or the other, right? You got agriculture not necessarily naturally occurring, and so that's a, you know, anthropomorphic introduced situation. Hydrological drought could be exacerbated by human activity. And so that's kind of what was going behind the scenes with these students, and I were thinking like, how did this manifest in the Spanish colonial period? Can we see evidence of agricultural drought or hydrological drought during this period of time at Monterey? Or is it natural? In either case, this leads to something called socioeconomic drought, which is both literal kind of impact to people in their economy, as well as just the impact of drought in general to the environment. Other things to consider too is that California is big, right? We have all these microclimates and different environments. And so the way California experiences drought is not necessarily consistent across. Of course, now with the movement of water by human means is going to disrupt natural processes, but we are essentially looking at the Central Coast area. I won't get too much into this, but there's just different types of rainfall, which again, I also was not aware of. But the short version of this is that rain varies, water varies. There's all these different factors that can affect rainfall, and tie that into any type of drought situation is gonna have different impacts to the environment and then different impacts to the people living in that environment. So trying to get back on course here. So what I was introduced to by a colleague was the study of historic drought analysis. And again, that's bringing into the fold of, you know, how did people experience drought? And again, from a more historic perspective and looking at primary sources essentially, and how was that documented? And can you compare that to different types of climatological data? And does it complement each other or does it deviate? What's going on there? And so I started to look into the literature. This was back in 2019, 2020. And this type of literature is very different than what I'm used to with archaeology. And I came across different reference systems. One is called the North American Drought Atlas, also known as NADA, and also the Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, or the Palmer Index. And these became invaluable resources to understand drought over time. I will say though that these are older models, and there are newer models out there. And these are just the reference points that I had when I conducted the study. So if you were to Google these, you will probably find like, oh, a modified version of such and such, or an updated version of such and such. I had what was available to me at that time, and I haven't updated it since. Using the Palmer Drought Severity, it's basically a scale of wet to dry. The golden triangle, oh no, I did hit my head earlier, so it might be shapes a little off today. But the golden rectangle, that is nearly normal conditions. Note that there is no normal condition. There's only nearly normal conditions for California. But basically negative 1.9 to 0.9 is considered nearly normal. And then anything plus above that is wetter. Anything -2 and lower is drier. And so this gives a nice range when looking at what's happening at a given locality. And I'll be citing this a lot. So you'll be seeing this a lot more. But generally speaking, again, negative 1.2 to positive 1.9, sorry, negative 1.9 to positive 1.9, nearly normal. No normal, nearly normal. And so if anyone's interested, this is the NADA. This is NADA, right? You can access it online and it's free. As you can see, it is an old interface. I took the screenshot last week. This is not been updated, right? Again, there's probably other revised data sets out there, but I still find this to be very useful. But basically what this data set uses is data from all the way back to 0 or 0000 AD to 2005. And it's taking proxy records essentially of tree ring data and tree ring chronologies to make a projection of the weather and what the environment was like, but only based off of June, July, and August. So you'll see reference to JJA. It's just specific to those months. And so what I did was I went into this data set, and you have different options that you can select. And I selected the single year map, and I would literally just put in every year that I was interested in. And so for this study, 1770 to 1800, a 30-year period. I did every single one of those years to see what I would get. And I know it's hard to see on this map, maybe it's easier to see on Zoom, but I have California highlighted, but you can go in pretty close. And I will show you in a few slides what that looks like for this study. But that was part of what I was looking The other part, because I got to make sure there's archaeology for the archaeology group, is the previous excavations at the Presidio and Mission of San Carlos. But in this case, focusing more on the Presidio, an early joint Presidio mission period. So here today, you can see the only remaining extant building, which is the chapel built in 1794, as the sole remaining structure of the Presidio of Monterey. Here we have a reconstruction based off of primary sources and other historical, or excuse me, archaeological studies. This was actually part of my master's thesis, where I looked at measurements from the documentary record taken by different soldiers at different periods of time. And then I compared that to previous archaeological studies and focusing on the foundations that were recovered, and tried to orient that based on what I saw from the primary sources. And so each color, I realize it's hard to see perhaps here, but each color represents a different iteration of a different build out. The golden is the earliest, 1770, 1771-ish, with the earliest chapel as a rectangle represented in the middle. And then where you have the 4 is the current chapel of 1794. And so again, you know, there's been a lot of shrinking growth at this site. There's been a lot of change, and that's not mostly the point of this talk, but just to give you some reference. What I will focus more on this talk is the archaeological excavations by Dr. Ruben Mendoza, who has graced us with his presence tonight. But he focused on the perimeter of the chapel, and what we have a map here is of the trenches that have different, well, for this study, mostly ecofacts, so like funnel remains primarily, that'll connect back to the drought. But essentially trenching around the chapel and recovering different, I believe the objective for Dr. Mendoza and the crew was looking at architectural features, but that also produced other data along the way. So I'll be referring to different trenches, and just to kind of give you a sense of the colored, the purple, the red, and blue, and yeah, those 3 colors, those are the focus that I'll be touching upon in a little bit. Just some pictures from the excavation at the time, some of the foundation. Okay, so getting back to the drought. So this is something that I found really useful. Was looking at these different publications from the 80s and the 70s. And it just makes me wonder how many of these types of resources are out there that are just waiting for people to kind of come across them. So again, once I was just introduced to the concept of historic drought analysis, I started searching the literature. What can I find? What can I find? And of course, I had a very narrow focus of looking at California during the Spanish period, and there was not a lot out there, at least not when I first did this in 2019, 2020. I didn't really find anything that was published at that time. But I found scholarship from the 80s. And so what I did was I drew from Mecco and Roundtree's work, who they had compiled based off of the Palmer index, different the scale of wetness and dry. And I just put that into a graph because they just had it as numerical form. And I'm like, that doesn't say anything to me. And I think once you put it into a graph form, it really gives you a much better sense of what was going on. So again, remember 1.9 to negative 1.9 is nearly normal. And then anything above 1.9 is getting normal to wet. And anything above negative 1.9 is getting dry to drought. And if you're looking at what's happening here, you can see that we do have a bit of nearly normal conditions, but look at those dry conditions. Yeah, pretty dry. We do have, you know, some wet, or one outlier, but in general, really dry. I will also point out though, that this is looking at 1772 to 1829. And again, my study is only looking at 1770 to 1800. And so I suspect some of the later drought and dryness, well, the extreme drought conditions after 1800 are well, I guess we'll talk about that later, but more anthropomorphic forcing essentially. But yeah, we do see like, okay, so it's been dry, right? Another kind of representation, again, this is all data from publications in the 70s and the 80s. I just put it into a different graph to make it more digestible for me. But again, you can see that, you know, in this case, the higher numbers are not necessarily dry, it's the lower ones. So notably, or excuse me, reverse that. I'm thinking of something else, but just again, more of the same data in a different form. But I find it really interesting that this has already been done. Doesn't mean that there's not more to do, but it's, you know, it gives a real insight into the climate at that time. Here's yet another representation. Again, all I did was plug in the data into some graphs. Do not let the colors throw you off. Red does not mean dry, blue does not mean wet. And then I tried to change it, but I was not able to. I created this table like 6 years ago, and I tried to, I think whatever system I created it would not let me go back. So don't let that color confuse you. But what you can look at is the numbers at the bottom here. Those are our PDSI. So 0 to -2 to 2, you know, that's our nearly normal conditions. And then you can look at the really lack of rain, lack of wetness going on, and the general dryness that's been happening. Again, spanning a longer period than what I'm focused on, but it's still pretty clear that there's been a lot of drought, right? It's been dry in California. So with that as our backdrop, I wanted to make sure we're on the same page of the PDSI and NADA, but now I want to look at that and look at primary sources that my students identified in part, and then compare that with the archaeological evidence to see, does that give us a better understanding of what was happening? Does that change the narrative? Does it not change the narrative? Or just try to get some insight of what did Spanish colonial life look like in relationship to some pretty clearly extreme weather conditions? And did they cause it or did they not? I don't know why I plugged this in here. This is just an illustration of the Presidio in its early years, 1773. You can see the Chapel of 1772, which is no longer in existence, but the Chapel of 1794 would have been constructed right behind it to replace it. But that's another story. So, focusing just on Monterey now. So we have here now 1770 to 1800, and essentially what we have here, and as obviously colored as I could make it, right? Moderate to extreme wetness and moderate to extreme drought. Let's say droughtness, not a word. But again, you can see, and this is focused on Monterey to Monterey area, very similar to what we were seeing at what was happening in California in general, right? Where we have a lot of dry periods, but also some wet periods. So what does that look like from the documentary record? So 1770, when we have the arrival of Sarah and the others to Monterey, they're coming at a time that's already dry, very dry. It's not red, but it's orange. This is pretty bad drought. And so part of what we were looking for in the primary sources is like, is there any reference, any acknowledgement of what the weather was like and how did that impact them? And so in this case, this is from Crespi in a translation where they note that, yeah, we had some rain, but not since we got here, just that 1 or 2 days. And I'm not surprised given what the PDSI is saying, that it's very dry. Some other observations, and I'll show you these maps in a slightly larger format, but you already can see that we go from dry to nearly normal. I know it's kind of hard to see the true color scale, but that's like a light blue, and the light blue is, maybe it's on the wet side. I don't know. You have to really look at those colors. To then dry again, and then wet. And so again, kind of flip-flopping. But in this particular primary source where it's talking about the mission of San Carlos between 1770 and 1775, they are acknowledging like, hey, sometimes we have rain, sometimes we don't. And so that seems somewhat consistent with what we're seeing in the other types of data sets. This entry always makes me laugh. So founding of the mission, founding of the Presidio, one of their initial objectives outside of religious conversion is trying to survive. And if you're reading along, you'll notice that they didn't do too good. Really bad. In fact, where they planted their earliest crops got washed out by saltwater. And what did it say? It is fit for nothing but nettles and reeds. So that's just bad planning, right? That's not weather. That's just, maybe you didn't look at the environment too well. Maybe you don't know what you're doing, you know. But that doesn't help, right? That's so bad start. Meanwhile, Pedro Fages, who's again the military leader, apparently had successful gardens, but he was a not nice person who didn't like to share. He'd rather see people starve. I have accounts of him. Actually, there's a whole list of complaints against him because he'd rather work his own men to death than feed them. So apparently he was doing okay, but everyone else, too bad. And at this point, we're not even looking at, you know, traditional settler colonist goals. We're looking at just bare survival of the soldiers and missionaries themselves, right? But he was doing okay. But again, that's a different story. Moving on, 1772. So kind of the same issue. With regards to crops, nothing worthy of the name has yet been achieved. Bummer. This is at San Carlos. Again, we're looking at the crops, and there is somewhat more favorable weather if you're looking at the PDSI. You know, I know it's hard to see in here a little bit, but that is maybe bluish. But they're saying the worst kind of famine was ever endured in the regions about Monterey visited us. I believe that's Englehart's translation of Sarah. And then he goes on to say that at Mission San Carlos for 37 days, we were without a tortilla or as much as a crumb of bread. And they basically had some beans and coffee. That's my favorite combination. But this idea of like, they were not doing well. Times were hard. So what's interesting though, jumping back into some archaeology, is what's been recovered. And so if you recall back to those units that I was showing before, the purple, the blue, and the red, this is some of what was recovered. And, you know, fish vertebrae is pretty significant in this context. Do we know what species this is? No. But I have a theory. Sardines. I can't say for sure that this is from a sardine, but there is overwhelmingly heavy primary source evidence that they were eating sardines. Insane amount of sardines. I can't show you all the quotes. I don't have time for all the quotes. I could probably do a presentation just on the sardines. But Sarah is constantly writing about these sardines. He's like obsessed with it. And he loves watching the Rumsen and the Esalen peoples fish. He writes about it all the time. And apparently they were so, I mean, Monterey, you know, Cannery Row, Monterey, like the sardines, like hello, duh, right? But they had so many, they had barrels of sardines that they shipped back to Mexico. That's how many, like, they were living it up with the sardines. And so it's interesting because that's something that was clearly an indigenous influence and clearly something that the Spanish colonists, I don't know if they would have eventually figured out the fishing because, you know, they are from also seafaring, but I think it's interesting that this is heavily documented in the primary source record. And so it's as well as the consumption of other fish. So I think it's interesting that that appears in the excavations. In addition to the fish vertebrae, there's also evidence of abalone, both red and black abalone. And again, I like to tell my students, you know, where is abalone? It's in the ocean, right? And some of it is deep, right? Do you think the Spaniards were deep sea diving? No. Uh, this is heavy reliance, at least how we interpret it. This is clear reliance on the Esalen and the Rumsen to save them, basically. And Sarah even acknowledges that. He does not name them by tribe, but he literally writes in his reports, he's like, we would not be here if it wasn't for them. So I think that's a pretty telling that if you're looking at, wow, we don't have any crops, or our crops aren't, very fruitful, but we have this evidence both in archaeology record and primary source in documentary record that there's fish and abalone. I think that's suggestive of something significant of this marine source. One of my former students did kind of like a count of the shell assemblage, and in Trench Zero, like there was a huge amount, or at least sufficient amounts of abalone as well as some other shells. Better watch my time. I'll come back to some more archaeology, but just to kind of give you a sense. So that seems to the period in which they were catching sardines, eating sardines, barreling sardines seems to align with these early years. And things just get worse, right? 1776 to 1777. 1777, really, really bad year. Really, really dry. And what do we see in the primary source in terms of support from primary sources? Acknowledgement of the bad weather, bad harvests, and that everything is drying up. They are praying for rain. 1777, same thing. Harvested but a little on account of the great drought. And again, explicitly using that word. This was kind of interesting searching too, because obviously when you're looking through primary sources, you can't just search drought. You have to look for any reference to what implies drought, but this was pretty clearly stated. So not a good year. However, this was not a good year for everyone. If you look at what was happening at a more regional level, you can see that most of California was pretty dry. And then a lot of the Southwest at the same time was also dry. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of look at, how did other populations, whether they were colonial or indigenous, respond to something as severe as 1777, considering how dry that is. That's I don't know, that's like between a 4 and a 5 there on the scale, I would say. And again, more references to that, right? They're just acknowledging in this report, acknowledging that it's been dry. They have a third of the wheat that they would hope to have. We, are reliant on the rains, and they're not coming. And then also irrigation. That's another concern too. That is one of the factors that is attributed to the relocation of the Mission and Presidio to separate, was the lack of water, and that going to the Carmel River would give them more of a water source. But even then, they're struggling. Moving on, 1778 to 1781, things have changed. Again, color not shown up very well, but those are 1778 to 1779 is kind of blue, and then the 1780, I would say nearly normal condition right there at least, and 1781, not too bad. So what's interesting is we go from this extreme dryness to somewhat normal or nearly normal conditions. So what happens? The cattle explode. And one thing I didn't mention before is that it's very clearly stated in the primary sources that they were not eating cattle in those early years. They could not. They had to save the cattle for exactly this later on. And so that was a no-no. But now they could finally consume them. But guess what? What happens to cattle? They also explode in their population. And apparently in Monterey, and at least in the herds in the Monterey area, got to be so bad and overextending with overgrazing, they had to relocate herds from Monterey to Los Angeles. There's also records and primary sources of different indigenous capturing and basically taking cattle from ranches in the Salinas Valley. But essentially, we're seeing this huge change in the population of cattle. And so part of the interpretation is like there was this huge reliance in those early years on those marine sources until the cattle population became established. And then, of course, if you have overgrazing from cattle, that's also going to play a role in drought conditions, right? So again, kind of dipping back into the archaeology a little bit, this is from one of my former students' work where she looked at doing an identification of frequencies, and shocker, cattle is the most prevalent species of the faunal remains that were recovered. She did recover one, I believe, metatarsal that she believed to be a bear. I don't know that we ever had that confirmed, but primarily cattle. And again, coming from those different units that we we're talking about earlier. And just some examples. Again, there's too much of this to go through, but it's very clearly there. Everyone knows that there was cattle in California. No, not a surprise. This is actually a throwback to my undergraduate work where I was looking through the excavations around from the trenches by Dr. Mendoza, and I went through the faunal remains to basically identify only, if I recall correctly, I think I only focused on intact specimens. I don't believe I looked at any fractured skeletal materials. That would be beyond my skill set. But essentially, I counted 1,000 different specimens, primarily ribs. Or if it wasn't easily identifiable, even if it was fractured, then it might have been misclassified. But it seemed pretty obvious that there was high consumption of cattle, or at least based on the ribs. But moving back on. So what we see then is that we had somewhat of a stable time, not very long, and now we're back to the drought. 1782, back to being dry. And then 1782 is a pretty big year for California and also the United States. So again, kind of jumping to Mission San Carlos, they again are mentioning drought. They've lost a lot, and they're saying that, oh, the wheat which was irrigated did well, but less than what was harvested the preceding year for the same reason. And the previous year was a better year, right? So that kind of makes sense that, okay, it's going well, going bad, based on what was going on. But just like 1777, this is not unique to Monterey. And I guess I didn't really say this earlier, but like you can see him on the peninsula there too, and the bay, and of course Santa Cruz right at the tippy top of there. So covering a big area on the left side there. But and then on the right there, you got the United States, and again, pretty bad regionally. And then it flip-flops again, where we have this change in the weather, so to speak, where we have wetter years, and then a random drier year, and then back to wet, somewhat normal, back to wet. And then it changes again. And so, you know, this is what I've been showing you so far. You know, my research in terms of the primary sources really only goes to, I guess, 1782, but there's a lot more that I haven't focused on here since I was mostly focused on drought in of itself. And so I would be curious to know, or to look back into, you know, how are they describing conditions at this time? And I want to say maybe I have done this to some extent. I'm just maybe not including it in this presentation. I don't recall. This is something that I did 6 years ago. It's been a while. Published more recently, but the original research is not as fresh. But again, coming back to, we see, okay, we got these changings. We got wet, dry, all the way till 1800 and after. Yeah, at least, but for my focus of my study, kind of ending at 1800. But like in those earlier graphs, you could see 1829. Oh yeah. Another interesting data set to consider is the soil. So soil samples were taken from the different trenches that were during the 2006 excavations. And my colleague at CSUMB, Dr. Scott Leiden, he conducted a pollen assay for us. This was in 2017, I believe. And in case you don't know your Latin, we have corn, wheat, common bean, pepper, tomato, and cocoa. And so we know these were all introduced primarily from the supply ships that were coming into Monterey. And the question is, to what extent were they successfully cultivated in the area? And if you recall back to some of the other primary sources, you know that there was repeated reference to the harvesting of wheat. And so wheat is sort of the more likely source to have been successful, at least based on what we're seeing here. Doesn't mean that's true for everywhere in California, but based on the soil assay, Scott basically deduced that it was most likely coming somewhere near the southeast exterior of the chapel. But again, in his full report, he sort of cautions against, like, you know, the pollen travels, right? Like it could also just come a long distance naturally. But we do know that they had these crops in the area in general. Another interesting factor is the presence of charcoal. And in Scott's report, he basically said that charcoal, it's unusual to have charcoal in these pollen reports. And so the fact that it was showing up was interesting. And we suspect it's probably related to one or more of the multiple fires that occurred at the Presidio. And y'all remember what happened in 1818 in Monterey? Some yes, some no. Bouchard, yes, Bouchard came in, our pirate. But basically Monterey was burned, including the Presidio chapel itself. And if you go to the chapel, I guess I should have included a picture. If you go into the chapel itself, you will see charcoal layer there, essentially. So it may or may not be related to that, but it's also just kind of worth pointing out. But this all came from soil samples that were recovered as part of that excavation. Gosh, 20 years ago now? Yeah. Oh, wow. So where does that leave us? Conclusion and future research. So clearly we see this flip-flopping of wet to dry and dry to wet. And again, this is just part of a study that kind of is more about exploration, just trying to get a sense of how did it impact, in this case, the Spanish colonists, as the primary area of focus, and how did that impact their day-to-day lives in terms of cultivating, agriculture, and survival. And it did, right? They had to have that reliance on, or what we interpreted to be reliance on marine sources to basically get them to the point of having successful cattle ranching, and then not needing that as much. At least it didn't appear in the primary sources after that main point of the early years. And so again, I don't think I can understate the impact of cattle to the environment and overgrazing and the impact of that in terms of drought and or being connected to that. But what I will say is, at least just for this teeny tiny period of 30 years, I don't know that I can say that drought was the result of anthropomorphic forcing, you know, in terms of the colonial presence or the cattle presence, because it just seems that it was happening on a more meteorological level rather than agricultural or hydrological in terms of any human influence. That's not to say humans don't have an input, but there tends to be an assumption that if you have a colonial presence, that it automatically, you know, has a immediate negative effect. And I do think that happened, but I don't know that that happened in this particular period. I think once we get into the 1800s later, then I think that's more likely when cattle ranching has totally exploded. And so this was just kind of like an interesting exercise for me and my students to sort of look at what was going on, you know, how did it impact their lives, and what does that tell us about the environment? And so for future research, I would basically recommend kind of continuing to look at these other data sets. Any of you who are interested in climate research, I do recommend that you check out NADA, check out the PDSI, see what the newer versions are, because they might be a lot fancier than what I was looking at. It was fun to kind of plug in different years and be like, wow, yeah, you saw it, that was really dry, or wow, that was really wet. And that might play some insight, especially if you have a historical archaeological project, then that may or may not be useful. Another aspect that was not part of this study was looking at Monterey County tree ring data. I don't have access to that, but that could tell a completely different story. I don't know. Obviously, more documentary research is always good, and looking at any other types of archaeological evidence from the other missions. In Monterey County in particular, we have more inland versus coastal. So I would be curious to know, you know, how did these situations, since they were so regional, impact these other sites, especially like when we look at more inland missions that didn't have direct access to coastal. That doesn't mean that maybe the Presidio didn't step in to support them, but I would be curious to know, like, did they have it? Was it worse? Was it better? What's going on? and what evidence supports that. So at this point, I know I'm watching our time, but I wouldn't have been able to do this project without the 2018 Mission Archaeology students who helped kick this off. So I would like to thank them. I would like to thank Dr. Emily Smith, who's my former student and just got hired at UC Santa Cruz as the anthropology lab operations and facilities manager, who did the faunal work. My colleague, Dr. Scott E. Clyden, who did the pollen assay, and of course, my mentor, Dr. Ruben Mendoza, and who conducted the excavations for the Presidio Monterey. All right, thank you. Question.
I did research for the restaurant.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You recognize me as a historian, extensively. And he taught graduate classes at water management. We went through all of this stuff. And he did have one comment: there is no normal.
Okay.
And I think in the 1800s, I think the situation continued. The classic is a storm of 62, 63, following drought. What's kind of missing here is the impact of the drought.
Right.
But there's the impact of the wet.
Yeah.
And the reason the Salinas Valley ended all up in David Jack's hands was because he loaned all those rancho owners money after already their cattle died because of the drought.
Wow.
To buy more cattle.
Yeah.
And then they all died in the drought, and he acquired all the ranchos.
You got all, yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, I that was the primary source or primary scholarship that was introduced to me, and that's, you know, it was really, really great data, and I was like, wow, how many of these publications are out there? And again, because this is not my primary area of research, it really took, you know, working with colleagues with different areas who aren't necessarily archaeologists, but have dabbled in archaeology, but have other backgrounds, and basically showed me this work. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And so I felt like I discovered, you know, treasure.
So my master's was in history, archaeology, and geography.
Okay. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. I find, you know,
so
it makes sense. I grew up in a interdisciplinary undergraduate. And so to me, anytime I can draw upon multiple data sets, I want to. It just gives me a better understanding. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I was curious, you talked about pollen analysis, and that made me think about pollinators. And were there pollinators that would pollinate the crops that had come from Europe, like the wheat or barley? I mean, is that a possible reason some of these things failed?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I know that much was being brought from Mexico, which would have been previously come over from Spain, but at that point they would have been in Mexico for like 200 years. So I don't know what role that plays, but that would you would have to ask Dr. Leiden. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I don't know if there's questions on Zoom. I saw that there's nothing yet. Okay. Just checking. I just want to know I didn't forget about y'all. Yeah.
And I've seen this term many times, and the volume measurement FNAGA. Do you have any idea like what that would equal to?
I should, but I think. Do you know, Dr. Mendoza?
It equates usually to a bushel.
Yeah.
Equates about to a bushel. Okay, so that's like a basket about, you know.
There's a wood box over at Mission Sonoma that is laid out in the museum there. was one of the units measured.
The volume was of
Yes, that's-
one Finega, okay, okay.
I was going to comment, I think that the research is significant in that you challenge several myths of emissions and the Presidios. And one of those is one that I hear every time I get into discussions about San Carlos and why Sarah left San Carlos to go to Carmel. And that is usually that he left there because he did not want the natives in proximity to the indigenous. But when you look at the environmental data and you look at the actual demographic history of the region, it's clear that he went there for other reasons, and one was survival, because the natives in the region had already pretty much, you know, as you noted, all along that area, what is it called? All along the area where we surveyed the area, that is that the outlet of the Carmel River, that whole area is covered with sardines from at various points, and you noted that. But in addition to that, you also had mollusks, and then you had the viability of agriculture, and that's made clear from some of the materials that are in the bins in that area. The other thing is the fact that the Spanish are using prophylactic measures to basically rid cattle from the area so that they don't overgraze the region. The fact that they're sending hundreds of cattle to Los Angeles because they've already—
It's going to be their problem.
Yep, yeah, it's going to be their problem, but over a much larger
Yeah.
landscape with much larger and more established ranchos.
Yeah.
So, you know, those are two things that
Yeah.
always come up. The cattle decimated California, yes, over the course of a long, duration. But but then you go back, for example, the idea of smallpox in California. The Spanish distributed handbooks in 1790 on how to inoculate the Indians against smallpox. There was no smallpox in California during the mission period. It comes back in during the Mexican era, and we published a paper on that topic. So, and now that I'm over at the Historical Society, I've been poring over the Spanish colonial and Mexican documents, and I've seen really the jurisprudence of the period also challenges many of the myths of that period. You know, some people take that to mean, oh, well, he's a proponent of the Spanish. No, actually, well, I grew up not much caring for the Spanish. My dad made sure of that, or the missions, or the churches. But I do look at the data and the characterizations of the time to get an impression of what they believe, just as today we have certain impressions of what's happening in our society. And those can go from one extreme to the other. So,
Yeah.
you know, how do you turn back the tide of civilization and civilization's predations on the environment and other people? So, you know, we would all love to see a peaceful society, but that's not always the case.
What's normal?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We don't, I just want nearly normal conditions. Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned somebody who had a productive personal garden.
Oh, yeah, Pedro Fages, who was the lieutenant. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He,
And he didn't care about the other.
oh, he didn't care about his soldiers. His, I read about that in some other publications, but there was a soldier, I'm completely blanking on his name, but he was a Catalonian volunteer. But Sarah helped him write a complaint. But basically, Fages, like, he wanted the soldiers working 7 days a week, which was, you know, shocking to them. And so for Sundays, he's like, well, you can do something easy like laundry, you know, just do your laundry on Sundays. But there were men who were sick, and he didn't want to spare a chicken for them. He apparently hoarded the chickens for himself. And this is all documented. He hoarded the chickens for himself and would eat them one by one in front of the men.
Oh my God.
He just basically gave everyone the finger, and yeah.
But he showed a bias towards the indigenous, punishing soldiers who interfered with indigenous tradition and ritual. And he reprimanded one of his captains for barging into a ceremony when they were looking for labor. And so that individual was reprimanded.
Yeah.
And then by the end of his life, he had adopted 9 orphan Indian children. So you're left to look at this guy's horrible towards his men. It seems to just have a disdain for his own countrymen, but he seems to care about the Indians.
indigenous were the ones that were surviving on the land.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Well,
if you read his, I would call it a cultural history of California, and there's incredible detail that he writes about the indigenous. He comes across like an anthropologist, but maybe with some curious interpretation.
Yeah. But so I want to say, I don't know if it was conversations we've had or others of where these gardens are, like where he kept these gardens, but apparently, between his hoarding of the chickens and his gardens, I guess he was okay, but everyone else.
It was
We
on, it was on
discovered
the
down
north.
in Castro, the way, because they had 9,000 acres.
Yeah.
And in the middle of Larkin Valley is this huge parcel that appears to be prickly pear
Oh,
They're using it as fencing.
as fencing to
Yeah.
keep the cattle out of there. It's identified as cultivated.
It's
land.
just-
How did they keep the starving men out of their garden?
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm surprised they didn't kill him. Yeah,
And,
yeah.
He had the small plot in his, he was living in the northeast quadrant under the bastion.
Mhm.
And I've seen depictions of that one area. So it wasn't a very large area, but he apparently was able to make.
show large hedges around.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean-
Probably with spikes. That you could see.
Yeah, I don't know who's keeping the soldiers out, but yeah, they were apparently not getting.
So those are the spikes still up here.
Well, we found, for example, copper tubes under the bell tower, which had been, peeled away from kettles. And I found an account in which the priest apparently would reprimand the men for smoking. So what were they doing? They were going up into the bell tower and smoking. And a couple of those tubes ended up at the base of the tower. So,
Well, they were figuring it all out.
yes.
Wow.
Exactly.
We're still figuring it
Very interesting.
out. Very
Yeah.
Climate studies are very
Yeah.
in these days.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to show, just like, if
Yeah.
anyone's curious, like there's a lot that you can do. And again, there's newer data sets out there. I have not explored that yet. This was really, like I said, this was really all just an exploration for me, but I think there's a lot of potential out there. And with Roundtree's work too, it just makes me wonder out, like, okay, how much data is just there already, and it just needs to be reviewed and compared with maybe other data sets.
Any of you UCSC students have interest in climate change?
I'm looking at it right now.
And he was really interested in how then, given all these problems,
Yeah.
Santa Clara Valley, whatever,
Yeah.
how people eventually learn to management with irrigation.
Mhm.
Instead of the dry farming.
Yeah.
I was gonna mention that in the digs at Soledad, we found, there was, when Farnsworth was there, I talked to him, and he said he'd been looking for the sun cut, the canal system, he never found it. And one day I was out, I'd heard of there was a gentleman visiting, I like to talk to the visitors. And it was an elderly gentleman, and he said, he says, when I was a little boy, I used to play in the aqueducto. And I go, aqueducto, and he said, yes, and get the sun cut. And I said, we would have to remember where that was. And so he took me all the way out, and sure enough, right off the side of the road, there was a grassy area. I was gonna say the grassy knoll, but actually there was a grassy area, and it had an alignment right where he used to play. So that was part of the canal, and we determined, because I took my students out with GPS units, and we determined that there was I think it was a 5% grade from the area where the canal would have opened all the way to the mission. And then in the course of excavation, we determined, and I talked to another elderly gentleman who approached me because he said, oh yeah, I'm the one that dug up all those burials over there in the parking lot. And he started telling me about the leather pieces and, Spanish colonial materials, and I'm suddenly, my ears perked up, and I go, where exactly was this? And he's showing me, and then he looks at me because I'm getting too interested. He goes, can I get in trouble for that? And I said, well, when did this happen? He said, about the 1930s. And I said, no, statute of limitations is over. Can you show me where the canal, because he said he backfilled the canal.
But these were Anglo burials, not indigenous
No,
burials?
they were Mexican era burials. Yeah, they were Mexican era. Nobody cares about them. It's, you have NAGPRA for indigenous, and then you have
Yeah, right.
the Mexicans who are essentially indigenous, but from across the
From
border.
Mexico,
And
right.
then you have the Anglo or the European.
Mhm.
And, but he showed me that the canal ran right in front of what would have been one of the store areas that is now the chapel there, because that's the Mexican era
Yeah.
chapel. And he said he backfilled it with stones, so if somebody wanted to find it, all they have to do. Yeah, it's all there. And so we determined that canal ran side by side with the El Camino Real, the Royal Road. And what I was interested in was before I talked to them, and before a consultant actually found a paper bag at the Monterey County Historical Society with a map done in the 1880s, it showed the exact configuration I projected based on the archaeology. So you have the neophyte quarters and the field to the south. One of the largest was about 400 feet long. And you had a quadrangle, and then you had what I would project was the canal, and then on the side towards the mission, you had the Camino Real.
Right.
So I thought of that because I thought, there was a lot of efforts to keep the indigenous away from Europeans because of the fear of disease. And that apparently was it was configured. Yeah.
So the canals were draining areas as well as
Yes.
water.
Yes, exactly. So, and in that area, they spent a lot of money hiring people to do resistivity and magnetometry. And what I did was, I thought they never found the neophyte quadrangle. So what I did was, I like to do home projects, and I was over at Home Depot, and I see these these rods, T-shaped rods with rubber handles for, probing.
No.
And I
Well,
thought,
yeah.
we're in an agricultural field, wow, we could stick those in the ground and test the foundation. And so I had the students go through every field, and I told them, you push this thing into the ground, and as soon as you hit it slows, I want you to take the depth measure. And then push through that until you hit rock. And before you know it, the whole field lit up with foundations. And then we tested one, and we went right through the middle of two walls and a hearth with missionary ceramics. And the last thing I was going to say, I'm talking too much, but the collection we returned to the Diocese of Monterey. And so there are over 10,000 specimens, I believe, there, ceramics. Some of it's in their little museum that they no longer open. But in the case of San Juan and other sites, I had 4 missions represented in our lab. One day a new dean came in, and she decided that I guess she didn't like my politics. She decided she was going to give the lab to a new faculty to use as a psychology area. And she wanted me to remove all the collections within 3 weeks. And then a NAGPRA person came in to do an audit and found, when I told her in front of the vice president that she asked, what's going to happen to this collection? What were 500 boxes of archaeological material emissions? I said, oh, it's probably going to go to the dump. And she said, oh, no, I'm putting an audit. So we were one of 2 universities audited. And now the collection is just sitting there in limbo at the university. I'm trying to get it back. I tried to get it back to the diocese. Not that they would ever share it, but at least it's protected. Anyway, that was my. I didn't want to do this on a downer.
I don't know that I have upper.
Questions for Jennifer? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, everybody. On February 5th, we will have Dr. Ruben Mendoza. Oh, excuse me, no, I'm sorry, Ruben's on my brain.
Okay.
Right.